Hmm. Okay, well, I guess we can get started here. I just want to say hello and thank you for joining the first Forest Adaptation Community of Practice webinar. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Annette Morand, and I am the facilitator of the online community of practice, the Climate Change Adaptation Community of Practice, which is run out of OKR, which is the Ontario Centre for Climate Impacts and Adaptation Resources, located in Sudbury, Ontario. And for those of you who are not familiar with the Community of Practice website, it's an exclusive interactive online community that brings Canadian provinces, territories, and other government workers together with climate change practitioners and experts to enable information sharing. And within that community of practice is actually the Forest Adaptation Group, which I'm sure most of you are aware of, which is an exclusive sub-community that is only accessible to those people working in the forestry sector and people interested in forestry. And this webinar is actually the first webinar for the Forest Adaptation Community of Practice. And the Forestry Group is already working hard on trying to set up a monthly webinar series. So stay tuned for news on that front. So just going over the agenda for today, I'll just give a short introduction for a few minutes, and then we will move on to the main presentation. That will go until around 1:45, and then we'll give about 15 minutes for a discussion period, as well as some closing remarks. But just a quick reminder before we begin, if you haven't done so already, would you kindly dial *6 to mute your phone? As well, mute your computer speakers since we'll be recording and sometimes the program will pick up some feedback from that as well. So thank you. Also, if you have any questions or concerns during the presentation, simply use the chat function on the top left-hand side of your screen. You can send me a quick message if you need an immediate response, or if you have questions for Suzanne or Jimena, if you would just please hold your questions until the end, that would be great. So just a reminder to *6 your phones. Perfect. So with that being said, on the line we have Suzanne and Jimena from the National Roundtable on the Environment and the Economy, who have generously donated their time today to present to us to talk about the economic implications of climate change impacts on Canada's timber supply. This webinar will focus on the approach they use to scope their analysis, the economic methods used to estimate the economy-wide impacts of timber supply changes, and the economic costs and benefits of implementing 3 adaptive strategies, and finally on their research findings.
Joining conference.
So please *6, thank you. And just so you know a little bit more about your presenters, Jimena is a senior policy advisor at the NRT, where she leads research, analysis, and consultation processes to advance national action to adapt to a changing climate. So from 2005 to 2009, she was a policy analyst at Natural Resources Canada, working on complex public policy challenges, including climate change adaptation, innovation in the forest sector, and science policy integration. And from 2000 to 2005, she performed research on sustainability issues for the Pembina Institute and the Center for Sustainable Development in the Americas, amongst others. She has a bachelor's and master's degree in geology and a master's in resource and environmental management. And also, Suzanne Loney is a policy advisor at the NRT, where she conducts research, organizes convening activities, and develops policy advice. Her work currently focuses on climate change impacts and adaptation, and she has worked with the federal government since 2005. And prior to joining the NRTEE, she worked for Environment Canada on emissions trading and as a program analyst in the Treasury Board Secretariat. And finally, she also has a master's degree in economics from the University of Ottawa. So I guess with that introduction, I'm going to turn it over to Suzanne and Jimena for their presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Annette. This is Jimena Eyzaguirre here. So I just wanted to thank the Forestry Adaptation Community of Practice for extending the invite, specifically to our colleagues at the Canadian Forest Service. it takes us quite a bit of time, and in particular this report did, to put together, do the research, convene stakeholders, and put together the report. So we're always happy to, when it finally comes out, to share our findings and kind of our lessons from it. So my colleague Suzanne and I will be taking you through about 30 slides or so, and as Annette mentioned, we'll be focusing on some of the report findings and kind of overview stuff related to paying the price, the economic impacts of climate change for Canada. So I'm going to start off, and then Suzanne will come in midway to tell you about some of the more technical aspects of the research and findings. So just quickly, a little plan about what we're going to cover. Just to kind of set the scene a little bit, we'll tell you a little bit about the NRC and the Climate Prosperity Program. Then moving on to the that we'll be talking about both the research and convening behind it. And then the last 2 points are really about the analysis, findings, and key messages that came out of the analysis related to ecosystems and also timber supply. So you'll note that the report is much broader than ecosystems and timber supply, but we specifically focused on these kind of chapter findings because we thought that would be the material of most interest to the community of practice. So, a bit of background then. For those of you who are not familiar with the roundtable or our work, we've actually existed for over 20 years, and kind of in the aftermath of the Brundtland Report and our common future, we were set up and formalized by Parliament in 1993. And we're a federal agency, arm's length from the government, with an independent role and mandate. And so really the National Roundtable is about the members, so that we currently have 15 members representing a cross-section of Canadians, and they are the ones who tell us what the priorities are to research and who finally approve anything that we release to the public. Suzanne and I are part of the Secretariat, which is a relatively small group of, under 30 people based in Ottawa. And we're the only national organization, as far as we know, mandated by Parliament to advise issues that integrate the economy with the environment. So the report that we'll be talking about today is within a broader climate prosperity policy research program. And this program began, about 2 years ago, or just over 2 years ago. And what we set out to do with climate prosperity was to provide insight, so do some research and analysis, and policy advice on both the economic risks and opportunities of climate change for Canada. So when we started out doing this policy research program, a lot of the discourse around climate change was about the economic damage that greenhouse gas mitigation policy could do to our economy, and there was little discussion of other important risks and opportunities related to climate change. So what we set out to do was try to shift the debate a little bit, take the focus off the economic damage from greenhouse gas mitigation policy, and talk a bit more about the opportunity to get ahead of the curve, to invest in adaptation early so we could shape our future. The messaging about it's not just about coping with climate change, but trying to prosper through it. And ultimately, we are a policy advisory body, so at the end of the day, what we're trying to do is produce reports that provide recommendations to government on what we can do to both adapt and prosper in a changing climate and position ourselves to compete in a low-carbon global economy. So on this slide, what you see is the series of reports that we are producing. So far, we have released 4. The one that we're talking about today is number 4. So within the Climate Prosperity Program, we have 2 research and advisory themes. One is on climate change impacts and adaptation, and the other one is on the low-carbon transition. So just earlier this year, in the winter, we released the report, Degrees of Change, Climate Warming and Stakes for Canada, which lays out some of the physical impacts of climate change for Canada for different sectors or systems and maps them against the global temperature scale. And we here in that report, we also talk in a very high level about some adaptation strategies that could be useful. So the report that we're talking about today is kind of a logical follow-up to degrees of change, in that we're trying to talk about physical impacts and then kind of in economic terms. So about the report, when we set out to do this research and convening for it, we had three objectives in mind. And one was basically to increase awareness of how climate change could impose to Canada. It could impose costs to Canada, so kind of the costs of inaction. Second, we also wanted to show that adaptation, locally and domestically, and greenhouse gas mitigation globally could reduce these costs. And third, we really wanted to, or hope to, encourage other sectors, regions, communities to do their own exploration of the economic implications of climate change for them. We know that adaptation, primarily occurs kind of locally or very specific in specific contexts, and which requires much more detail and information that what we're able to provide nationally. And we hope that by doing this work, it would kind of stimulate others to do their own analysis. So just quickly, the structure of the report. Some of you may have already, skipped through it or read a few chapters, but essentially it's pretty straightforward. It starts off with an introduction, scene setting. Chapter 2 provides a summary of our findings from our original top-down economic modeling, so kind of the Canada-wide cost of climate change. Then chapters 3 through 5 focus in on specific impact areas, both a quantification of physical impacts as well as a monetization of those. Then chapter 6 is really a qualitative analysis that tries to look at the kind of economic implications of climate change-related shifts in ecosystems. Then we conclude in chapter 7 with conclusions and recommendations for government. So just a note on kind of the approach that we took in very, very high-level terms. So in any of the work that we do here at the roundtable, we kind of rely on two pillars, and one is research and the other one's convening. So on the research side, we used a combination of two economic approaches, and one was the use of top-down modeling, the PAGE 09 integrated assessment model, to generate estimates for the country as a whole. And then to complement that, we used a bottom-up approach for our sectoral analysis of timber supply, coastal areas, and human health. And for each of these analyses, we narrowed the scope first to priority impact areas, guided by data availability. Then we estimated the cost of those impacts, and then the costs and benefits of adaptation. The methods for impact quantification and monetization differed across the three impact areas, and Suzanne will tell you quite a bit about the methods involved in the timber supply study. Excuse me. And in terms of the ecosystems chapter, we used a primarily qualitative approach there. So given the uncertainty underlying this work, we are presenting results out to the end of the century, and really our desire to produce results under a range of possible futures, we used scenarios. So one of the things that we had to establish first was what sort of assumptions we would make about future climate. And here we relied on two IPCC emission scenarios, A2 and B1, to drive both a high climate change and a low climate change scenario, respectively. Then we had to make assumptions about how Canada demographically and economically would develop between now and the end of the century. And here we used kind of assumptions of slow growth, both in terms of demographics and economic, and rapid growth. So overlaying those two kind of drivers, climate change and socioeconomic, it results in 4 different scenarios and 4 different sets of results. This way, we were able to present a range of possible economic impacts depending on future climate change and socioeconomic growth. Now, when we set out to do this work, we are pretty cognizant of the fact that there are several limitations to doing economic assessment of climate change impact. And there are some, limitations that could not be easily overcome. So first of all, even though we're using economics as a way to raise the profile of the issue and make it sound more urgent or compelling, we know that economics is not always perfect tool to either frame the problem or kind of assess the solution. And so for some people, other indicators are more meaningful. Second, we know that some impacts are more easily quantified or monetized than others, and this itself lends a bit of bias to the analysis because, for example, it's easier to quantify damage to infrastructure from sea level rise and increased storminess. It's easier to do that than to monetize, the ecosystem changes from sea level encroachment. So, we went through our analysis with mind as well. And third, as it might not come as a surprise, the issue of data availability and of consistent quality, particularly because for several of our analyses we were trying to do a national level analysis, which posed some challenges in a few instances. So this is a diagram taken from the report, and I think we do a good job in highlighting the fact that we are aware that whatever economic estimates we produce are riddled with uncertainty, and we try to show that and highlight that as much as we can, noting the assumptions and limitations, in each of the chapters and then in the appendices. So on the convening side, we use several kind of mechanisms to bring stakeholders together and get their feedback, advice, and guidance along the way. We had a formal advisory committee which guided us throughout the whole project cycle. We had 2 waves of expert review, and actually, I'm not sure if a couple of you may have been on our technical panel that reviewed the timber supply study. We also had a few regional state consultation sessions last fall. Once we got the initial findings from the sectoral analyses, we went out and tried to test, whether they resonated with people and whether they seemed credible. So that was very useful for us. And finally, we did take the draft report chapters and get them reviewed by experts as well. So before handing it over to Suzanne, who'll focus on the results and conclusions from the economic analysis of climate change-related shifts in timber supplies, I just wanted to draw your attention briefly to the messages in our chapter on ecosystems. So when we first started scoping this project, it became apparent that we had to do something on Canada's forests in some way. And so initially we tried to do a more fulsome analysis than just covering commercial forestry, but we quickly ran into some gaps in the knowledge, both in terms of ecological knowledge, but also in how to apply economics to the valuation there. So what we did is then draw readers' attention to the value of looking at ecosystem services and goods and how climate change might affect those, and the ripple effect of those changes throughout our economy through this chapter on ecosystems, which is primarily qualitative. So we know that ecosystems are essential to our well-being and that they are sensitive to changes in climate conditions, but we tend not to think of the services and goods they provide in economic terms, although that might be changing slightly because of the work done with tea, or the economics of ecosystems and biodiversity and other kind of new research that's come out since then. But the thing is that our ability, the risk of not including kind of changes in ecosystem services resulting from climate change is that their economic value can be ignored. So given the that climate change poses some issues for Canada's ecosystems, it's critical to factor this into any assessment. Although, as you know, this is not an easy task. So as I mentioned before, we were limited by gaps in both ecological and economic kind of knowledge and the knowledge base available. So what we do is try to highlight the connection between climate change, shifts in ecosystem goods and services, and the economic impact of those shifts through very, very small examples in recreation. And finally, that chapter also highlights that economics or monetization is not always useful, and I already kind of spoke about that. But this chapter really tries to say that first, there are other indicators that are more useful to people, and second, that there are some instances when what we face is not a marginal problem. So the decimation of tropical coral reefs, for example, we can't really call that a marginal problem. So economics and cost-benefit analysis in particular is of limited use in instances such as those. So if you take a look through our ecosystems chapter, what you'll see is a bit of analysis on how we can expect recreational spending to change in a changing climate. Our first example looked at park visitation. So research shows that warmer temperatures boost attendance at national parks, which in turn could lead to higher visitor spending. So we estimate that visitor spending could increase by 48 million per year by mid-century at 5 national parks. Those are Mount Revelstoke and Glacier, Banff, Prince Albert, Point Pelee, and Lamorlisi. And the 4 million estimate is under high climate change assumptions. The next example looked at impacts on recreational fisheries. So we looked at how higher lake temperatures could expand the range of smallmouth bass while reducing the range for lake trout, and how smallmouth bass could outcompete trout for food. So as lake trout is a popular species among anglers in Ontario, we estimated angling revenues could fall by 9 million per year without a lake trout fishery. So really these are very small examples, but we just felt like we couldn't go without including something on ecosystem shifts in a changing climate. And now I'll hand it over to Suzanne.
Right, so now we'll get into some of the details of the timber supply study. And I'm just going to take you through both the methods and the results for that study. So starting off on this slide here, this is an image that was taken from our report as well. And what you have in this figure is the bigger picture of the different ways that climate change could impact on Canadian forests through changing temperature and precipitation and through changing weather patterns. And what you can see in column 2 here is a range of physical impacts that we could expect. And that includes the first 3 there, which are the ones we focused on, forest productivity, forest fires, and pests and diseases, along with others such as extreme weather events. And the reason we chose to focus on the top 3 impacts that are listed there is first that they most directly affect the quantity of timber supply that will be available in the future. And second, there is enough evidence available for us to be able to conduct an analysis on physical impact. And then if you look at the third column on the economic and social impacts, this shows different impacts we could expect as a result of changing climate. And again here, we focused just on 2. We focused first on the timber supply changes that would result from changes in forest productivity, forest fires, pests and diseases, and then looked at how those timber supply changes could carry through to effects across the economy. But we do list some others there that would also be worth studying in the future. That includes human health impacts and non-market values of changes in forest-based ecosystems. So that gives a big picture of the kind of scoping that we did to create boundaries for our study. And now with the next few slides, I'm going to run through our methods in some detail. So just first, this slide shows you the big picture of the steps we went through. We started with identifying the climate change-driven impacts that we wanted to explore. And then we used scientific literature to estimate the extent to which these impacts would lead to changes in the timber supply, and then went through from there to estimate the macroeconomic impact. Once we looked at the economic impacts of the changing timber supply, we started to bring in adaptation considerations. So we identified adaptation strategies that could reduce the cost of climate change, and then we assessed the cost and benefits of those strategies. So on the next slides, I'll go through those details in turn. And I just wanted to mention, for this technical analysis that I'm going to run through, we worked with Dr. Van Lance at UNB and also with Marbeck Resource Consultants. Okay, so starting off with the first step, we wanted to determine how much the timber supply would change as a result of changes in forest fires, forest productivity, and pests. So first, for forest fires, we built from CFS research that was published in 2005 by Flanagan and his colleagues. And this research estimated the percentage changes in the area that could be expected to be burned in a future climate scenario that we were able to align with one of our scenarios, our high emission scenario for the 28th. And then working back from that data point, we extrapolated to our other scenarios and other time periods to develop a full set of estimates. And we were working with the assumption that for every additional 10 square kilometers that would burn, the timber supply would fall by 1 square kilometer. Then for forest productivity and pests, the main source of research that we used was a publication by Loney et al. In 2008. And that publication set out qualitative estimates of how timber supply could be expected to change as a result of forest productivity and pest outbreak changes. And then we used judgment to map those quantitative estimates into, or those qualitative estimates into quantitative estimates for our own work. And just one important note on the forest productivity work is that the assessment we were working from took into account changes in temperature and precipitation, but it didn't include the potential of higher levels of carbon in the atmosphere to accelerate productivity. So that was beyond the scope of our study. So since the scientific estimates we were working with were developed for ecological zones, and we wanted to look at 6 Canadian regions that were divided provincially, we had to map the results from the forest zones to our 6 regions. And those 6 regions that we considered were British Columbia, Alberta, one region that included Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and the 3 territories, then Ontario, Quebec, and Atlantic Canada. And the work initially developed both optimistic and pessimistic estimates of the kinds of changes we could expect from these 3 impacts of climate change. But in our final report, we released averages so that the results would be more consistent with the other sectoral studies, and also just to keep the number of figures and charts and tables under some sort of control. So going through from there, once we had estimated the changes in timber supply, we used computable general equilibrium, or CGE models, to look at what the economic implications of those timber supply changes could be. And just at a very high level, CGE models are economic models that forecast, they're run through computers, they forecast macroeconomic trends, and they build in very simple assumptions that represent regional economies and their complicated interactions. And they are able to pull in consumer demand, labor and capital supply, and markets for production inputs and outputs. So we didn't just use one CGE model for the full study. There were several. We had to create a separate model for each scenario, for each time period, and each region. And we did that by scaling up the input and output tables that are in these CGE models based on our socioeconomic growth scenarios. So the first step in running these models was to establish baselines. So we ran each regional model in the scenario where there is no climate change to figure out what that baseline is. And then we shocked the model by changing the forest and logging sector output. And we assumed that the forest and logging sector output would change by the same percentage that the timber supply was expected to change. And then those models were all executed again so you could compare the model outcomes with and without climate change to understand the economic differences. So once we had done that initial costing, we then turned to look at adaptation strategies. We identified strategies that met a few criterion that I've listed below. We wanted to find strategies that did seem to have some promise in cost-effectively reducing the impacts of climate change. Also, strategies where the impact would be large, could be applied on a large scale, where we had enough data to be able to implement the research and the modeling. And then finally, it needed to be suitable for our modeling approach. So a kind of adaptation strategy that we could work into this CGE modeling framework we were using. So we looked at three strategies that are quite generic. First being enhancing forest fire prevention, control, and suppression. So that could include things like prescribed burning or enhanced firefighting. We looked at increasing pest prevention and control, and that could include things like minimizing the risk of introducing new pest species in a forest or spraying pesticides more aggressively. And then the final one we looked at was planting tree species that were suitable for future conditions. So there you'd be taking the expected future climate into account and choosing what tree species to use for replanting efforts. And on that last one, we definitely recognize that there's concerns about using assisted migration, risks that could pose in terms of maladaptation consequences. But given the scale of regeneration activities that are already in place in Canada, we thought it was worth exploring. So for each of these adaptation strategies, we looked at the extent to which they would be expected to offset the negative impacts of climate change on the timber supply, and also the costs and benefits of implementing each strategy. So that involved making assumptions about the effectiveness of the strategy in reducing climate change impacts, the cost of the strategy per unit area over which it was deployed, and the size of the area where the strategy would need to be applied. And I could get into the specifics of that during the discussion if there was an interest. So once we'd estimated the extent to which the timber supply would be impacted by climate change with the adaptation strategies in place, we once again reran our CGE model, this time shocking them with the new forest and logging sector output. And now we could compare those model outputs to the model outputs without adaptation strategies in place to assess what the benefits would be of adaptation. And I'll just point out some of the key limitations, though we do detail them in provide more detail on those in the appendix to the report, but just a few key ones here. First, the fundamental complexity of ecosystems makes uncertainty about the physical impacts of climate change on the timber supply inevitable. We recognize that internal forces like changing species composition, as well as external forces like major weather events, could both shift the projections that we've built from, and also that all of those different forces could interact. Another assumption we needed to make was that the three impact types we looked at are additive, as in the impacts of on fires, pests, and tree productivity are all separate and additive, but really these could interact. For example, if an area forest is already affected by pests, it may be more vulnerable to fires. We also, as I mentioned, made an assumption that a 1% reduction in the timber supply would lead to a 1% reduction in forest and logging sector output for our CGE modeling, which is obviously a simplistic assumption. And then a couple of other limitations. One is that our provincial and regional aggregations do diminish the accuracy of our results for any one specific place. And we didn't look at interregional and international dynamics, which would of course be an important part of how the economic impacts played out. So I'm going to turn to some of the results now, starting with the results that we were using in terms of timber supply changes for each region over time. And this is what the information we needed to feed into the CGE model. So you can see here that the timber supply is expected to fall in all regions as a result of climate change, but that the western provinces show a greater timber supply declined in the eastern provinces. So these figures that I'm showing here are all in the report. This table here shows our economic results. It shows the extent of GDP reduction in each scenario over time. And you can see that the relative GDP changes are actually higher in the 2050s than the 2020s, but then they somewhat subside by the 2080s. And that's because in that later time period, the GDP growth is actually outpacing the growth in the cost of climate change. We'll spend a little bit of time on this table here. This shows the results for the 2050s for each region. And you can see that the economic impacts do vary a lot between regions, both in absolute terms, which show billions of dollars figures, and in relative terms, which is the percentage figures in that table. So one observation that I think is worth pointing out with these results is we can't predict the sensitivity of regional economies to climate change just by looking at the extent of physical changes in the timber quantities. Another really important thing we need to think about when we assess the economic implications is the structure of each regional economy. So there's at least two factors there that come into play. One is the relative size of the forestry sector relative to the entire regional economy, and the second is the degree of reliance of other economic sectors on outputs from forestry. So if you remember 2 slides ago, I can actually flip back so people can see that. Here we show that that Alberta could actually experience a greater percentage of changes in timber quantities than BC. And then moving forward from there to this table, the relative cost of these changes differ markedly. The forest industry in BC is a larger component of the provincial economy, and the forest industry in BC is also more important to the rest of the provincial economy than is the case in Alberta. So the cascading effects are more significant. I also want to point out an important caveat on this slide, and that is the results that relate to Manitoba, Saskatchewan, and the Territories. So what I first need to say there is that these results are for an aggregation of 5 distinct regional economies that each have their own varying characteristics. And here we did come up with quite a high estimated impact on GDP. And thinking through that, we thought, well, there could be 2 possible contributors to this relatively high economic impact we estimated. First, it could be the size of the aggregate forest industry relative to that aggregate regional economy. Second, it could be the extent of interaction between the forestry and other industries of the regional economy. So when we thought about that first one, is it the size of the aggregate forest industry? Well, it didn't appear so because the forest industries in Manitoba and Saskatchewan are much larger than those of the territories, but they're only about as important in GDP contribution to each provincial economy as the case in Alberta. So this leads us to think that really these high economic results are being driven by these cascading effects that the changes in the forest industry produce. So that is the effects on other parts of the economy. And it's hard to really decipher what the drivers of that would be because of this aggregation of the different regional economies. So here, a separate analysis for Saskatchewan and Manitoba certainly would have been more informative in understanding the dynamics for those 2 provinces. Then turning to our results for adaptation strategies, we found that the adaptation measures we looked at were cost effective and that they reduced the cumulative cost of the timber supply loss to about 20% of what it would have been without adaptation. And we anticipate that the adaptation strategies would have co-benefits, and that those could include things like sequestration of GHGs, reducing forest fires, and contributing overall to more sustainable forest management. But definitely, we're also aware of some implementation challenges. There's definitely uncertainty about the effectiveness of each strategy, and there are definitely also some ecological risks of maladaptation. So applying any strategy at such a large geographical scale is also a concern. So just one slide here to wrap up. So Jimena and I have finished with this project, the the report was published in late September, but we're hoping that that kind of work and this kind of economic assessment will continue, that others will choose to apply economic tools to look at adaptation options and decide which strategies to implement. Jimena and I are currently working on a new report in the Climate Prosperity series, and that report focuses on private sector adaptation in Canada, and that's the policy advisory report that we're aiming to publish in the spring. And in that report, we're putting together advice for businesses on how to move forward on adaptation, and also for governments on how they can help the private sector to advance. And one part of that report I thought would be interesting to note today is that we're conducting research, putting together a series of case studies on corporate adaptation leaders, and those case studies will likely include 2 Canadian forest products companies. And we're hoping that this kind of profiling and messaging will also help keep the ball rolling. There's definitely other initiatives that are relevant to climate change adaptation in the forest sector that are underway. Examples include the work that the Canadian Council of Forest Ministers is doing, and their identification of becoming a world leader in adaptation as part of the CCFM's vision is one of those. Also, the work of BC's Future Forest Ecosystems Initiative on adaptation is relevant to this as well. And maybe we can spend some time in the discussion talking about some of the links and connections between our work and other work. And then a few thoughts based on our own experience in terms of moving this kind of research forward. I think that further risk assessment would be needed to assess the relative risks and benefits of assisted migration of tree species. And also we uncovered in some of our research concerns about the structure for incentives for adaptation, and that in some cases where the forest manager is different from the landowner, incentives might need to be better aligned to encourage more effective adaptation. And we do hope that any additional work that's done making economic assessments of adaptation options for Canada's forests would be made at the scale that's relevant for decision making. It likely wouldn't be a national analysis that would be helpful in moving things forward from here, but something more focused, driven to answering a specific research question. So that concludes our presentation, and I just wanted to make one quick point that maybe will kind of preemptively answer some questions people have, and that's to mention that Jimena and I are also planning on doing a webinar in January for the full Adaptation Community of Practice that focuses on the lessons we learned through this whole report development process, not specifically on the timber supply chapter, but on the report overall, and sort of hopefully transferable lessons for others that are looking to use economics to look at adaptation options. So I'll leave it there.
Okay, great. Thanks, Suzanne and Jimena. So I guess the floor is open for anybody out there that has a question. You can just unmute your phones, or if you would like to just type it in the chat box, I can read it out for you. So ask away.
It's Diane Roddy. I just wondered if you guys were tied in with Mark Johnson's work on the impacts of climate change on the forest fringe in Saskatchewan. He's giving a talk about it at the CIF electronic lecture on November the 23rd.
Hi, Diane. It's Jimena. I have talked to Mark in previous venues, like a conference board meeting and stuff like that. So I haven't been in touch with him in a while, but I do know that he's definitely someone to check back with this because he's quite plugged in both the research and the applied side, talking to private sector folks and everything. So this conference that you mentioned, where is it taking place?
Well, it's electronic. So the Canadian Institute of Forests offers it for their members, and so you just sign in on November 23rd and just listen to Mark for an hour at 1:30 Eastern time. Should I send? I'll find a way to send you this meeting notice.
Great, thank you.
Okay.
Thanks, Diane. You can, if you need to send anything to Suzanne or Jimena, you could also just email me and I can forward it. That's also an option if that makes
Okay.
things easier for you.
You bet. Thanks.
You're welcome.
Hi, it's Mariette here. I just would like to suggest, since we have this nice website, you have a calendar over there, and any event you want to post and share with everybody, you could put it there.
Great idea, Mariette.
Right on. Thanks.
Hi, it's Kelvin Hirsch from the Northern Forestry Center.
Do you have a question?
I do. Wasn't sure you guys were hearing me.
Oh, yeah, we hear you.
Yeah. Okay. Great. So it's a little bit around the methods, and in particular, looking at things like the fire and pest and the assumptions that were made. Understanding that when you're working at a national level, you have to kind of make these major assumptions about how things go forward. I was wondering, though, in your work, did you do any types of sensitivity analysis around the assumptions to see how the model results were maybe affected by changing those assumptions a little bit around the number that you chose?
Well, I'll start to answer that, and Jimena may have something to add. But one of the major ways that we tried to build in this uncertainty was through the use of these optimistic and pessimistic assumptions about what timber supply changes could be seen from the three different impacts. So we do have the detailed consultants report that provides those results, so you can see the division in results between them, and that's something that can be made available if it would be of interest. So that's one way, and then another way that we tried to not lose sight of uncertainty was through the use of the 4 future scenarios that Jimena described earlier in the presentation.
Kelvin, I think, and we do try to emphasize that in the chapter, that the assumption that there's a one-to-one correspondence between timber supply change and forestry and logging output change is a really big one. And if we had more time and resources, I think I would have tried to do more sensitivity analysis with that assumption in particular.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, thanks, Kelvin. Any other questions out there?
Hi, it's Harry Nelson out at UBC. I've got a question. When you were looking, we're doing some modeling work at a more local scale through this FFEI, which I'd like to present to the group probably in the next month or so. But one of the things that we're finding is that the level of disturbance will probably drive most of the timber supply impacts. And I was just curious, given the costs around fire suppression, how do you factor that into your analysis? And the other question was, the sensitivity testing happens when you start to postpone some of the timber supply impacts if you put it off years, because that's when we start to, at least from our work, that productivity is improving faster, but the disturbance that catches up with you probably about 50 years out, 60 years out.
You were sort of cutting in and out there, and I'm not sure I fully understood the question. I understood that you were interested in knowing more about what kind of assumptions we made in terms of the costs and the effectiveness of the forest fire adaptation strategy.
Yes.
But then the other aspect that you mentioned about postponing impact, can you explain that one again?
Well, I guess part of it, and this may have been some of the sensitivity testing, but if you postpone some of the timber supply impacts, say 20 or 30 years, that significantly changed some of the cost-benefit ratios that you came up with, the benefits of adaptation?
We didn't look at the timing, we didn't look at different options for the timing of adaptation, so that's not something that we explored. In terms of the assumptions we made for the forest fire prevention, control, and suppression adaptation strategy, we basically pulled from basically did a literature review of the cost of different fire suppression activities per hectare from about, say, 6 to 8 different sources, and put together an average of what those costs could be. So because, as I mentioned, these adaptation strategies are pretty generic. They're not a specific forest fire control strategy. So we developed this sort of average cost per hectare, looked at what scale over which the forest fires would be expected, what extent of land coverage, and then how effective would this forest fire adaptation strategy be. So we don't assume that every acre or hectare that's treated with the strategy would necessarily therefore avoid avoid forest fires. Instead, we assume that the strategy in that case would be effective on 75% of the areas treated. And the assumptions we made for each of the 3 strategies in terms of the cost and the extent of effectiveness are all set out in the appendix to the report. There's a specific appendix on the timber supply study, and so if you wanted a little bit more detail about what assumptions we made and what the sources were that underpin those, you could find that information there.
So I guess let me just maybe ask again then, of the 3 possibilities, pest, fire, and change in productivity, I mean, how did you you remember which ones kind of were the main drivers? Reduction in timber supply?
Well, I guess to some extent that's just illustrated through the assumptions we made about the cost and effectiveness of each. But when we ran the CGE models and we shocked them with the timber supply with adaptation in place, that was just one model run for all 3 adaptation strategies implemented together. So we didn't have a disaggregated economic impact stemming from each of those 3 strategies. But broadly speaking, I would say that just based on timing, the assumptions we made around the planting alternative tree species, our assumption was that basically those effects don't kick in for a long time. So at least in the next 50 years, the big drivers for any adaptation savings are the enhanced forest fire prevention and the pest prevention and control.
Yeah, I think in terms of impact, if I recall correctly, in sort of the western forest, the natural disturbances of fire and pests are bigger drivers of productivity, but in the eastern forest, I think productivity is slightly higher.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks, Terry. I think we have about 5 or 6 more minutes. We can take a few more questions from anybody out there.
It looks like there's one that's
oh, sorry.
on the screen here.
Okay.
So a more detailed version of the report, including the assumptions. Yes, so beyond the appendix that is included in the main report, there's also the consultant's report that underpins that full chapter of our paying the price report, and we could make that available upon request. So if anybody is interested in getting a copy of that, they can just send me an email and I'd be happy to pass it along. And I'll just quickly give my email address, but I'll also just type it into the discussion box here so everyone can see it. So it's suzanne.loney@nrt-trnee.ca. So I'll just type that here.
Perfect. And I think Cindy is writing a question, so we'll wait. In the meantime, are there any other questions from everyone on the phone?
I can respond to Cindy's question that was just posted.
Perfect.
So what reactions have we had? Some of the impacts may seem insignificant to some. I think that we've been quite pleased with the reaction to this report. It seems that we have been able to fill a bit of a gap in people's understanding of some of the economic dimensions of climate change and get a little bit more profile to this issue of the impacts and the cost of climate change itself, as opposed to just the cost of climate change mitigation. So I think overall positive, and we also, some of the questions and feedback we've heard suggest that others in government are also thinking about whether they could do some sort of economic impact or economic assessments along the lines we've done, but at a different scale for decision making. So we're hopeful that we'll see some of that pick up. In terms of feedback on the impact seeming insignificant, I'm kind of racking my brain here. It's not something that I've heard come up, not in the media coverage or really in briefings that we did on the report release. I think one of the reasons, or a couple of reasons behind the response that we got is that before the release of the report, we did some good technical briefings with key media outlets. So we were able to kind of walk them through the research. They could ask us questions about some of the underlying assumptions and the scenarios and all of this. And so the way they characterized our report and the findings in it, we were pretty pleased with. Also, to our knowledge, this kind of analysis hadn't been published before for Canada, so there's not a lot to compare it to. So I think that kind of speaks to what you're asking, Cindy. There's just not a lot to compare to.
Harry, can I just to follow up on Cindy's question? What was kind of because you reviewed, I guess, with the various stakeholders, what was the industry response? And kind of a follow-up question, have you guys actually identified 2 companies in Canada that are actually being proactive? Really?
Yeah, I mean, in terms of an industry response, I wouldn't say that there has been sort of one response from specific industries to this report. We have not heard a lot of specific feedback, and a lot of the media coverage was actually quite general, just hitting on sort of the highlights of the report overall. We didn't see a lot of coverage of the specifics of any one sectoral study that we conducted. So I mean, I guess our earlier discussions with experts in government and in industry, as we were working through these methodologies and working through the results that came in, was basically just sort of the main concern that came up was warnings about how our results could be interpreted, and we always heard that it was really important for us to be clear about what the limits are, what the big assumptions are, what's needed next. So we tried to do that in our report, and that's why it's a little bit thick. So I think that helped us a lot.
Okay, thanks, guys.
And just quickly, no kind of real response from any kind of either FPAC or various provincial kind of industry associations, or the companies even?
Sorry, this is Jimena here. No real formal response, I guess, official response, but Paul Landsbergen from FPAC was on our advisory committee, so he was integral to kind of some of the decisions that we made along the way.
And again, this is probably just curiosity, being out here in BC where companies aren't really engaged at all. Question, I mean, you said that you wanted to identify 2 Canadian forest products companies that were examples of kind of resilience. Do you have 2 in mind, or are you looking for those? I mean, curious to know whether there's any out there.
Well, we've actually already completed the 2 case studies, but I don't want to spoil the surprise.
No, that's fine. I understand.
So the one thing that we're learning from our kind of direct dialogue with different companies from different sectors is that adaptation is taking place, but people aren't calling it adaptation. So some investments or choices that they're making because it increases overall either forest ecosystem resilience or it increases kind of water availability, hedging some bets there. So I think that that's one of the issues that, from a public policy perspective, we'll have to grapple with, the whole communication, how to engage private sector on it.
Thank you.
Okay, thanks everyone. So we're running out of time, but is there any final last comments, remarks?
Yeah, there'll be one from me, Marie-Ève, from CCTF Secretariat. So I would like to, well, first thanks our presenter. That was a good presentation. Thank you very much. If there is any other people that would like to present, like today, please contact me or Anna, and we'll be looking for a place to organize a webinar for your presentation. Also, I wanted to say that this has generated a lot of discussion, and we will set up a forum on the website so that you could discuss about it. And I'm not saying here that Suzanne or Emma will answer any more questions over there. It's mostly for the people who attend. If you want to discuss or share a document or whatever you find, there will be a place dedicated to the topic of the forum we had to. And finally, there is also on the website a contact section where you could put who you are and you could email to people. So if you have other questions or if you want to contact someone, please use it. It's there for you. So thank you.
Okay, thanks, Marie-Ève. And definitely a huge thank you goes out to Suzanne and Jimena for giving us time out of their day to present for us. I'll be signing off at my end, so thank you everyone for attending, and don't forget that you should be receiving an email shortly, maybe today or tomorrow, with a recording of the presentation, and it'll also be available on the FACoP website on the new webinars page. And we'll put the presentation in PDF form in the FACoP library as well. So thank you everyone for a successful first FACoP webinar, and have a great day.